thank you to the students that could make it. I know there's a lot of other events going on, so thanks a lot for making it out. I'm just going to go ahead and introduce the moderator, Abdeen Jabara. He's a New York civil rights lawyer, a board member of the Center for Constitutional Rights, and has been involved with the National Lawyers Guild for roughly 3 decades. He's also the former president and national vice chairman of the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee. Jabara was involved in the murder trial of Saran, who was convicted of assassinating Robert Kennedy, and extradition case of Ziad Abu Ain, who was extradited from the U.S. to Israel to stand trial for a 1979 bombing in the city of Tiberias. Abdeen Jabara hasn't let difficult cases keep him from working to ensure full rights under the law for Arabs and Arab Americans. More recently, Jabara, concerned with civil rights issues of Arab Americans and the rights of Arabs living or traveling in the United States, challenged the practice of law enforcement agencies to collect information and maintain surveillance on Arab Americans. In addition to litigation, Abdeen also involves himself in organizational activism, such as the Boycott, Divest, and Sanction movement, which is what we're going to talk about today. And so I'd like to introduce Abdeen, and we can get started.
Well, what's really nice is we had a practice session last evening, and makes things a little bit easier because we now know what the order of events are. I first want to thank the co-sponsors to the event, today's event, the Jewish Voice for Peace, Adele of New York, the National Lawyers Guild, and the Center for Constitutional Rights. This is the second event, as you probably know, dealing with this issue in 2 days. Last night's event at NYU brought out a wonderful crowd who had some very cogent questions, and both of our panelists today spoke there and also gave presentations that I think were very illuminating. Boycotts of Israel are economic and political cultural campaigns of action that seek a selective or total cutting of ties with the state of Israel, Israelis, or Israeli corporations. That is kind of a summary of what BDS is about. Such campaigns are employed by those who challenge the legitimacy of Israel's policies or actions toward the Palestinians over the course of the Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflict, oppose Israeli territorial claims and settlements in the West Bank or Jerusalem, or even oppose Israel's right to exist. That is, I'm reading now from Wikipedia. It doesn't say right, in what way is right to exist. I mean, it could say right to exist as a solely Jewish state, etc. But it doesn't say that. The boycott effort, boycott, divestment, and sanctions effort has had some successes in the United States. As early as 2004, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church voted to initiate a process of phased selective divestment in multinational corporations operating in Israel. In our neighbor to the north, Canada, the Ontario section of the Canadian Union of Public Employees approved a resolution to, quote, support the international campaign of boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel until that state recognizes the Palestinian right to self-determination and to protest the Israeli West Bank barrier. The Toronto Assembly of United Church of Canada supported that statement of the Canadian Union. In July 2010, the Olympia, Washington Food Co-op decided to stop selling products from Israel in 2 of its grocery stores. One of its members of its board of directors brought a lawsuit against the co-op, which was thrown out of court, and he was directed to pay attorney's fees. The World Council of Churches called for a boycott in 2010 of products originating in Israeli settlements. Now, in March 2012, the Park Slope Food Co-op, that's in Brooklyn, rejected a motion to boycott Israel. That is, 5 products that it was selling that were manufactured in Israel. And here's the collector's item Metro newspaper, Middle East battle makes ways to market shelves, about that vote. I regard that vote, even though they lost, as an enormous victory because of the amount of consciousness that was raised, and one of the people that was heavily involved in that effort, Dennis James, is here today at this event. And it was for weeks, for months before the vote that was taken, and the vote was really about whether the whole issue should be put to the entire 16,000 members of the co-op. That was what the vote was about. And what was defeated was not the boycott itself, but whether the matter should be put to the entire 16,000 members of the co-op. So it was, but in the whole month that were led up to that, there were constant letters and articles in the co-op newsletter and leafleting and what have you, and it was an enormous consciousness raising opportunity. The reason I say that is because following that at Brooklyn College, some of you may know, there was also a conference on BDS that raised an enormous hullabaloo in the city, and the forces that opposed that conference, that forum, were roundly defeated in the press by the cognoscenti and the academics in the city. That was a big sea change in the city for what happened. And the reason I'm saying that is because we're here living in the Big Apple, and the Big Apple is kind of a petri dish, I guess, if you will, for the United States, because as we know, there's an incredible amount of support for Israel by in the city, and so when the Brooklyn College issue arose, and there was the denunciation of the people that tried to shut it down, that was a huge, huge change. So far, the chief proponents for some iteration of BDS have been churches, trade unions, food cooperatives, professors and lecturers, artists and musicians and actors. And the BDS movement has had a considerably more success in Europe than in the United States. I have not listed all the things that have happened in Europe because we are living here, and it's understandable that it would be more successful in Europe because the United States has been the principal benefactor and lawyer for Israel ever since the 1967 occupation of territories, and therefore there's only been several instances in which there have been divestment here in the United States, and one of our speakers will tell you about those today. So without further ado, what I want to do is talk about, I just want to mention one other thing. I think the biggest impact here in the United States has been on the cultural and artistic level. It's been, we've had a number of musicians and artists and actors, some of them with very high name recognition, who have refused to go to participate in festivals in Israel and to perform in Israel and to appear or to receive awards in Israel, etc. So that is it's probably kind of understandable because their fan base does not depend upon the larger socio-economic matrix of control in this country that so many other corporations, etc., experience. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers here who have come to us from Chicago and Detroit. We're delighted to have them and to have them here in New York City and to address this issue. The first speaker will be Barbara Harvey. She's an attorney in Detroit, Michigan, who after a stint as a law professor missed the intensity of litigation practice and became a plaintiff civil rights and civil liberties attorney at the Michigan American Civil Liberties Union legal director, focusing on free speech and equal rights issues. If ever there was a First Amendment lawyer that you want to have on your side, Barbara Harvey is the person to have there. She drafted an anti-surveillance ordinance for Detroit. You know, we had a spate of, we had a red squad in Detroit at the Detroit City Police Department and in the State Police Department that, you know, worked together with the federal authorities, and that was adopted by the City Council but was vetoed by the then Mayor Coleman Young. She has dedicated most of her legal career, and where she really made her mark, to fighting for the rights of workers within their unions, being convinced that organized labor needed to get back in touch with its members, and who can gainsay that, to regain its power. And she participated, she's currently the general counsel to Teamsters for a Democratic Union, the largest and oldest caucus of union members in the world. She has become an activist in the Jewish Voice for Peace, and she conceived of the campaign to persuade TIA Kraft, who some of you may be members of, to divest from companies that are involved in the Israeli occupation. And we'll hear a great deal about that campaign and its peregrinations over the past several years from Barbara. So I'd like to ask you all to welcome me and welcoming Barbara to New York and this panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Abdeen. You're going to hear less about TIA Kraft this afternoon than you heard last night.
Can't hear enough.
How many people here are here for informational purposes, just wanting to learn a little bit about BDS and what it's all about? Most of you, I'd say. Okay, that's very helpful to me. I'm going to start by giving a little bit of a bird's eye view on BDS, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions. It was begun at, actually, it was begun before 2005, but in 2005, an official call went out from Palestine civil society, from basically all of it, 173 NGOs, civil society organizations, and 71 political parties and unions in Jordan, members of parliament, a unanimous call for nonviolent economic resistance to occupation. And it was agreed that there would be 3 goals. And the 3 goals are, number 1, an end to the occupation, meaning a withdrawal to back behind the Green Line, the pre-67 Green Line. Number 2, equal rights for the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And you never hear the word Palestinian citizen in Israel. Palestinian citizens of Israel are known in Israel as Arabs. But they are, the Arabs who are citizens of Israel are Palestinians. And number 3, recognition of the right of return of the Palestinians who are in the diaspora. Those are the goals, and they are about the most basic human rights, really basic rights. The right to have a country to belong to. The right to have enough water to farm. And water that is unpolluted so you can drink it. The right to an education. The delays at checkpoints, settler attacks, IDF arrests of school children have made it so difficult and dangerous to go to and from school that it is widely viewed in Palestine now as a form of nonviolent resistance to occupation to achieve a high school diploma. It used to be that Palestinians had the highest literacy rate in the world. This is really hard on the Palestinian people. Another one of these basic rights is the right not to languish in prison without being accused of anything at all, sometimes for years, and without a hearing. The right to travel from home to market, to sell your vegetables and to buy things. The right to travel to a hospital, to give birth at a hospital instead of at a checkpoint. Nearly 100 women have died in childbirth at checkpoints, giving birth on the cold ground in the winter. The right to put a toe in the water of the ocean that Palestinians can all see from the hills where they live, and many of them die without ever setting foot in the ocean that's so near. The right to farm the land that has been the land of your ancestors for centuries, and the right to basic freedom and dignity. Because all of these things that I've just identified characterize the Israeli occupation. They're all basic characteristics of life under occupation. The BDS movement was inspired by Gandhi's nonviolence, by the US civil rights movement and Martin Luther King's leadership, and by the South African anti-apartheid movement. Its purposes, of course, 2 basic purposes though. The obvious one is to achieve the goals of the BDS movement by economic pressure. The second, not as obvious purpose is actually more important because it is more effective, and that is to achieve the goals of the BDS movement by popular pressure. And the popular pressure will come as Americans learn from BDS activists about the injustices of life under occupation. And popular pressure has worked in the past. In South Africa, that was the biggest single factor in the success of the anti-apartheid movement. The economic pressure, the actual economic pressure of boycott was almost inconsequential compared to the impact of the popular insistence upon an end to apartheid. The response to this idealistic call in Europe has been robust, and even in Australia, and even in Canada. The response in the United States has been horror, born of the ignorance that results from a long history in this country of media self-censorship, which has caused a state of continuing ignorance about what it means to live under occupation, which has been going on now. This is its 46th year. the longest occupation in modern history. There is no precedent for this occupation. And it becomes more ferocious with every passing year because, in fact, time is on the side of Israel in this occupation, and so are lengthy, drawn-out negotiations. But Israel is beginning to understand that time is running out, and it keeps upping the ante. Every single day it is taking more land, literally every single day. And another reason why we respond and recoil from BDS has to do with the fact that we as Americans have been immobilized by the trauma of the Holocaust, which is a real trauma, and it not to be minimized, forgotten, or overlooked as something never to be repeated. But this is not about the Holocaust. This is not about the destruction of the State of Israel. It is about creating a healthy peace rather than a military peace, which is imposed at the point of a gun. And it is that sort of peace that will be achieved and will only be achieved by equal rights and justice for Palestinians. That is what will bring stability, and nothing less. So where is the BDS movement now in the United States with this background? In the spring of 2009, Hampshire College, a small school, divested from companies profiting from the provision of military support to the Israeli occupation, denying that its action had anything to do whatever to the fact that a BDS divestment campaign was going on campus, and that a divestment resolution had been adopted and had been presented to the governance, the administrators of the school and the governing body. Instead, the school said that it was a result of its periodic review of its investment portfolio under its socially responsible investing criteria. And in fact, the companies that it found failed that review were all targets of the divestment resolution that the students had adopted and presented. And this is fine. It's not a problem. It's always going to be like this. It's never going to be, no one's ever going to admit that they, well, maybe someday it will change and become socially acceptable and even desirable. And then people will admit that what they are doing is bowing to pressure that they see they cannot really successfully resist to do the right thing. Because the pushback so far has been very intense, and I'm going to talk about that shortly. In June of 2010, JVP launched the TIAA CREF campaign, and that's Jewish Voice for Peace, a national campaign to persuade one of the largest retirement investment companies in the world, over $500 billion in its own and other accounts that it manages, mostly mutual funds of its own, to divest from the occupation. And in April or May of 2012, TIAA CREF divested from Caterpillar in its SRI accounts, socially responsible investing accounts, which it said had nothing to do with our campaign and the fact that we had totally monopolized the past preceding to annual meetings, and completely monopolized with confrontations of the CEO, Roger Ferguson, with questions of various kinds about why the company was still forcing its retirees to retire in part, whether they liked it or not, on the profits of the Israeli occupation. And they said that it was just a result of a decision by its screening company, the company that screens out companies that are not qualified for socially responsible investing, which had not screened out Caterpillar. Caterpillar supplies Israel with the D9 bulldozers that are, once they reach Israel, under U.S. Defense Department contracts, I might add, they are weaponized and armor-plated and sent out to bulldoze Palestinian homes and cause other problems. MSCI is its screening company. The MS stands for Morgan Stanley. A Morgan Stanley affiliate delisted Caterpillar and stated in its announcement that Caterpillar's sale of D9 bulldozers to Israel was a key factor, his phrase. Well, the pushback must have been fierce because a little while later they quietly removed that announcement from their website and never mentioned the D9 bulldozers by Caterpillar again. But we have hard copies of them. We captured images of them, and we can show that it actually was stated. And this is the typical pattern that we see with every success. There's pushback, and the battle has just begun after a decision has been made, in fact. And you will find that in your work. The adoption of a divestment resolution may be just the beginning of your battle. And you have to proceed on the assumption that it will work out that way, and maybe by proceeding on that assumption you won't have to face the post-victory trauma that follows, but you can generally count on one. I'm going to, in fact, go directly to campus divestment now, because I actually believe that without student activism, those artists and musicians who have refused to perform in Israel would not know enough about the topic to even think of that sort of response to an invitation. Without the work of student activists on campuses, they have been the heart and soul of the BDS movement, and that is where the movement will succeed, and it will succeed. In 2009, when there was the Hampshire College divestment action and the first Students for Justice in Palestine conference at Hampshire College, that was a beginning. Now there are more than 100 chapters of Students for Justice in Palestine on more than 100 US campuses. And Muslim Student Association chapters working hand in hand with them, and JVP affiliates as well. And you have an interfaith coalition of students and progressive alliances working hand in hand on campus. It's truly an inspiring model of attempts at reform. There is a law office in Israel named Sharat Hadin, the Israel Law Center. And Sharat Hadin has a US, in fact, a New York City office. And Sharat Hadin, in response to the activism on campus, sent out a letter to 150 colleges and universities in the United States telling them that they needed to subject SJP and MSA chapters, Muslim Student Association chapters, to heightened scrutiny before approving them as approved student organizations on campus. Because, as we all know, they are associated with terrorism and anti-Semitism. And this put, the recipients of these letters into a horrible bind, because what was being demanded in this letter is conduct that actually would violate the Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is the provision that makes it against the federal law to discriminate on the basis of race, color, or national origin if you are the recipient of federal funds, and you will be at risk of losing those federal funds if you engage in such discrimination, which was what Sharat Hadin was effectively demanding. And moreover, the First Amendment has something to say about the sort of demand that was being made as well, because the First Amendment absolutely prohibits, with only very narrow exceptions, content-based discrimination against speech. And those exceptions basically are speech that presents the imminent, as in the next minute, danger of violence. Shouting fire in a crowded theater is the classic example of this exception to content-based discrimination against speech, assuming that the yelling of fire is a false statement. And the other exception is defamation, which is not enough in itself to be subject to restriction. It has to actually cause an actual injury before it may be subjected to restriction and litigation. Otherwise, content-based restrictions or discrimination against speech is a violation of the First Amendment. And the First Amendment trumps everything else, as we know. There's the law students in the room know. Well, the National Lawyers Guild, which I'm part of, and which I'm specifically part of a subcommittee of the International Committee called the Free Palestine Subcommittee, and we put together a group called the BDS Legal Support Working Group, and put together our response to Shirat Hadin, which we sent to the same group of colleges and universities that had received Shirat Hadin's letter, explaining why what Shirat Hadin was demanding was a completely unacceptable demand under US law and the Constitution. And what has subsequently happened shows a pattern in which it seems clear that the universities know that we are right, and we are right. And what they are doing is their due diligence, so that they can make the record that they have gone out of their way to make sure that everything is okay, that nobody is engaging in conduct that might subject the university to liability for loss of its federal funds, but that they know that they can't do more than that, and that that, in fact, may be too much, in fact. The pushback has been very interesting. The bullying and intimidation by Shirat Hadin and the Israel Action Network, which is a coalition of which the Jewish Federation is a major partner, and other such organizations, oh my God, has had an impact. It has been traumatic and very unpleasant for students, and sometimes scary, in fact, because there has been very intense encounters at times. But probably the greatest impact that it's had has been good for the movement, in fact, in many ways. Some of them obvious, some of them more subtle. Difficult as it has been, it has intensely showed student organizers the importance of putting shared goals above all else. And in fact, they have. They are working together without infighting, in harmony, focusing on shared goals, and that's all. It has been an amazingly effective response by the students, by such inexperienced activists, no less. It has intensified the personal commitments of activists, actually, to the movement work. And it has laid bare the crudeness of the response to the work of the activists. For everyone who has seen it, and everyone who has seen it has been appalled by it. I've been told I'm pretty much out of time, so I'm going to try to work the legal issues into the Q&A afterward. There are important legal issues that I do want to discuss, including the anti-boycott laws and the current, which are really no longer a factor in the opposition because we have so decimated the argument, And the current opposition, legal opposition, which is the argument that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. And I particularly want to address that. I hope we get a chance to do that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara, for that very informative presentation. I just want to say a couple of things before I introduce our next speaker. And that is the tactic before the anti-Semitism charge against BDS was the, quote, delegitimization charge, that, oh, they're trying to delegitimize Israel. The reality of the situation is that Israel has been its own greatest delegitimizer. And it doesn't take BDS to delegitimize Israel. The new anti-Semitic is the old charge that has been dragged up, that has been used historically. This is not something new. This has always been a constant frame that if you were anti-Israeli practices, you were anti-Semitic. Well, and that even cropped up in a most recent article by Peter Beinart in the New York Review of Books this past week or so, talking about the cocoon that the organized Jewish community lives in relative to the Palestinians, that they don't know any Palestinians, they don't talk to any Palestinians, they don't know anything about the suffering that the Palestinians have been suffered. And he uses that to talk about by walling themselves off from Palestinians, American Jews fail to understand the very behavior they seek to prevent. The intellectual isolation also keeps the American Jewish mainstream from comprehending another phenomenon it deeply fears, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel. The American Jewish establishment generally attributes the support for BDS among various academic, professional, and Christian organizations to resurgent anti-Semitism. Again, this is more of the blaming the victim, of course, argumentation. We're going to constantly face that until that has run its course and they come up with whatever else they come up with. Our next speaker, Rima Kapitan, is a owner of Kapitan Law Office. I strongly support that. I was the owner of the Abdeen Jabbar Law Office. It was wonderful being a solo practitioner. I didn't have to answer to anyone. It was great. Her practice consists primarily of litigation on behalf of employees and advising of businesses or employment law matters. In recent years, she has increasingly focused on academic cases representing employees in appeals of tenure denials and employment litigation in free speech and discrimination cases. She has spoken on the topic of academic freedom at conferences of the AAUP at various locations. She was a managing partner in a law firm, and she was an extern for the Honorable Richard Cudahy of the United States Court of Appeals, who must be from the Cudahy meatpacking family. And she was admitted to practice by the State of Illinois Supreme Court and is a graduate of DePaul University College of Law and Indiana University Individualized Majors Program. And without further ado, please welcome Rima Kapitan for her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, for the introduction, and thanks very much to all the sponsors of the event, especially the NLG for hosting us, and also the Code Z. And I'm going to start my timer and try to keep an eye on the time. So I'm discussing today, I'm going to argue that Zionism should be one of the targets of BDS, that ending Zionism should be one of the explicit goals of the BDS movement. And I'll also talk about one of the tactics of the movement that's been the most controversial, the academic boycott of Israel, which I'll argue is a crucial component of the movement. The Campaign for Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions is a nonviolent movement initiated and led by a broad set of non-governmental organizations in Palestine, and it's made up, the leaders are made up mostly of people living in the occupied territories, and they're the ones who we're taking our lead from. And BDS is the latest in a long series of nonviolent actions that the Palestinians have partaken in. And it's not the first instance of that the boycott method has been used. In fact, it was used during the First Intifada, and it was used against the British during resistance to the British occupation, sure. I'd like to discuss in a little bit more detail the BDS goals. Some critics have argued, and some BDS activists have acknowledged, that the goals of BDS aren't limited to the freedom of the occupied territories, to Israeli withdrawal, to securing Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories. What BDS argues is it demands that Israel comply with international law, and it calls for ending Israel's occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall, recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to equality, and respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes, as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. So if these three principles are put into practice, as Norman Finkelstein and others have pointed out, then the default result will be that, that Zionism will end, that the majority will be Palestinian Arab, and that Zionism can no longer be the governing principle in the land if it's going to be a democratic country. And my argument is that it should be, ending Zionism should be an explicit goal of the BDS movement, and not merely a logical conclusion of realizing those three explicit goals. And that's primarily because Zionism is the root cause of the conflict, and I think that the goals of Zionism, the BDS movement, should be geared towards reversing the problems that are at the heart of the conflict, one of which is the occupation, but the occupation is not the only one. And so I think that there's a danger that BDS goals can be misunderstood by those who heed the boycott call. For example, and what can result is a watered down version of the boycott, which isn't as helpful and can sometimes even be harmful. So the European Union decision recently not to do business with any companies who are in the settlements is a historic move, and it's the first time that the European Union has endorsed the boycott as a tactic. But it's also very limited, and in fact it says nothing about doing business with Israel, which is Zionist, but also is, of course, the state that supports and perpetuates the occupation as well. And the settlements can simply respond by moving their companies to Israel and get rid of this problem and avoid any harmful effect from the boycott. Similarly, the United Church of Canada, which is the biggest Protestant church there, heeded the boycott call, but it focuses again on settlements. And I think if we focus instead on calling for an end to Zionism, then we're calling for an end to all aspects of Israeli apartheid, not just in the West Bank and Gaza, but in Israel and with respect to the refugees. And we're also asking the people who heed the boycott call to do a more comprehensive boycott that will be more effective in pressuring Israel economically and making it more democratic. So Norman Finkelstein, who is a critic of the one-state solution and of the BDS movement, has said that the basis for solving the conflict has to be what international law has to say. And on that point, he's in agreement with BDS movement. But what he says is that there's near unanimous consensus on what the law says. The settlements are illegal. East Jerusalem is occupied territory. The West Bank and Gaza are occupied. But it's also correct that Israel is a state. That's also the law. And he says there's nothing in international law for one state. And he also says that the International Court of Justice, in its opinion about the apartheid wall, said that the pre-67 border is Israel's border. And I'd argue that it's not the case that there's nothing in international law for one state. In fact, the international law protects the right of self-determination. And if the Palestinians decide as a people that they want to live in the land that they're legitimate residents of and have a democratic state on that land, then the one-state solution is one of the possible results of the exercise of self-determination. And in critiquing the goals of BDS, the supposed goal of ending Zionism, many, Finkelstein and others, use overwrought rhetoric about what ending Zionism would mean, making it seem scarier than it actually would be. Dr. Finkelstein said that if BDS goals are met, Israel has to be effaced from the world's map. Historian Harold Brackman concluded that the campaign was a stalking horse for those seeking to destroy Israel by other means. The efforts against Israel on campuses constituted an academic jihad. And the Algerminer said, using soft power, pro-Palestinian groups have been able to hijack the narrative of peace, justice, and human rights, while in reality they yearn for Israel's destruction. And so the anti-BDS campaigners are deploying this rhetoric using violence and referencing ethnic cleansing to try to delegitimize the movement. The end of Zionism does not mean the destruction of the state of Israel or the denial of self-determination for Jews. It's about implementing the right to self-determination for Palestinians. And the only thing it takes away from the Jewish majority is the right to be a majority in a state in which the legitimate residents are not majority Jewish. So the only reason, in my opinion, that the goals of the BDS movement are a bit conservative or circumscribed is that historical injustices have resulted in the containment of Palestine to the West Bank and Gaza, and the containment of Palestinian aspirations as well. Palestinians have largely accepted the status quo, but that's changing. More and more Palestinians have been arguing that the solution that makes most sense is that we all live together in one democratic state, and even the ones who support the two-state solution often feel that it's simply an interim step to living together in one democratic state. And I'd like to talk a little bit about international law with respect to the conflict. It's a broad topic, but generally, law is a contested space, as those of you who are law students know. Law is neither static nor is it always rooted in justice. And both the existence of certain laws and their interpretation should be constantly re-examined and tested. In the United States in the 1940s, the law said that internment of Japanese citizens and residents based on national origin was legal. But that's certainly not a law that was rooted in justice. And we also know that certain sources of law take precedence over others. In that case, the Constitution took precedence over even the decision of the Supreme Court. And the same applies in international law as well. With respect to the International Court of Justice decision, Dr. Finkelstein says that the West Bank and Gaza are the unit of self-determination for the Palestinian people. So he says that the International Court of Justice has the right to determine for the Palestinian people where their state should be constituted. And to put it in legal terms, the International Court of Justice didn't have jurisdiction to determine how the self-determination of the Palestinian people should be exercised. And in my view, the opinion didn't do that in any case. The opinion reaffirmed the principle of self-determination, recognized that Israel's border has yet to be established, and criticized the fact that the separation wall was in effect annexing parts of the West Bank, which was illegally occupied. And more importantly, a more primary source of law is the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which guarantees the right of all peoples to self-determination. But it says, by virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. So many of the problems that currently exist in Palestine, in fact, began with the United Nations as a result of lobbying efforts of the United States and the Zionist movement and others. Around the time of the partition resolution in 1947, the International Court of Justice emphasized that the freedom entrusted to the United Nations, which was new at that time, was not unlimited. The UN had no sovereignty over Palestine at the time, and thus no right to override the right of self-determination of the native population. And in fact, there was a committee on the Palestine question within the General Assembly that also questioned the right of the United Nations to make that decision. And it said the UN cannot make a disposition or alienation of territory, nor can it deprive the majority of the people of Palestine of their territory and transfer it to the exclusive use of a minority in their country. And that opinion was ignored by the General Assembly and wasn't really considered. And of course, after the partition resolution, Zionist forces took over more territory by force and expelled a good number of Palestinians as part of a plan that was written and well documented called Plan Delay. And this was, of course, against international law. The concept of title by conquest has been abolished, and several international documents, including the Nuremberg Charter and the Security Council, have affirmed the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war or by military conquest. And so I would argue that there's no reason we still have to abide by the status quo that's resulted from these unjust and illegal actions by the United States and by the United Nations and the Zionist military forces. Many Palestinian activists feel that their movement and their goals have to be circumscribed by UN Resolution 242, which called for withdrawal of Israel from the territories that were occupied during the 1967 war. And that resolution emphasized the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war and affirmed the necessity of a just settlement of the refugee problem. And it didn't merely call for withdrawal from the occupied territories. It recognized that there was a need for a more comprehensive effort to resolve the conflict. And it requested that the Secretary General designate a special representative to establish contacts with the states concerned to promote an agreement and assist efforts to achieve a peaceful settlement. So one of the central ways in which Israel perpetuates the ideology of Zionism is through its universities and schools. And it is partly for this reason that the academic boycott of Israel is crucial to the success of the BDS movement. Most generally, universities are the intellectual leaders of society and the country's main source of development and training for the political elite. More specifically, Israeli universities play a major role in legitimizing Israel and providing logistical support and training for the perpetuation of the occupation and the Zionist structure of the state. For example, Hebrew universities built on confiscated Palestinian land in East Jerusalem, which was designated as occupied territory under international law. The Hebrew University administration restricts the freedom of speech and protests of its few Palestinian students. For example, it forbade the commemoration of the invasion of the Gaza Strip in 2008-2009, in which about 1,400 Palestinians were killed. Israeli universities are also directly involved in training programs for the Israeli General Security Service, the Shin Bet, and play leadership roles in the Hasbara propaganda initiatives of the Israeli government, which is one of the main targets of BDS. And Israeli universities in Israel actively suppress dissent on the part of their own students and academics. For example, Israeli historian Ilan Pape writes about his own experience being banned from holding a conference about the historiography of 1948 at the University of Haifa. And he says that this isn't an isolated incident. Israeli academics, their academic freedom is severely restricted in Israel. And he said, quote, "This episode illustrates forcefully why the boycott of Israeli academia abroad is justified, not just as part of the overall pressure on the Jewish state to end its brutal occupation, but also as a warning to the scholarly community in Israel that its protracted moral cowardice has a price tag on it. One of the main critics of the academic boycott, in particular as a tactic, is the American Association of University Professors. And it's the basis, of course, of its view is its stated long-standing commitment to the free exchange of ideas, and it feels that the academic boycott of Israeli institutions would harm the free exchange of ideas. However, the AAUP, courts, and academics alike all acknowledge that academic freedom is not absolute. And often when there are conflicting rights, some have to take precedence or some kind of compromise is reached. The AAUP has taken an appropriately strong stance urging protection of the right of academic institutions to decline to participate in particular types of speech. In one series of cases, the AAUP joined the Yale University Law School and a number of other law schools who didn't want to be forced to bring military recruiters to campus to recruit their students. And in response, the federal government said, withdrew federal funds from these schools, and those were a major source of funds and hurt the schools tremendously. And so they filed suit. And the AAUP endorsed this academic boycott of the military as itself constituting a form of speech, emphasizing that, quote, our institutions are judged by our actions as well as our utterances, unquote, and recognizing, quote, the importance of the faculty's role in constructing an appropriate educational environment, unquote. So for the government to force Yale to allow recruiters access to students would be to impair Yale's constitutional right to determine for itself the appropriate means or method of expression. The US Supreme Court ultimately was not persuaded to protect faculty members' right to send a message about the military's discrimination policy in that case. But there are other cases, and in that case it determined that the military's interests prevailed, were more important. There have been other cases in which the courts have recognized boycott as a right that related to the right to expression. It was protected by the right to free speech. For example, the Supreme Court held that when black citizens banded together and collectively expressed dissatisfaction with a social structure that denied them rights to equal treatment and respect, the boycott clearly involved constitutionally protected activity. And it explained that through the boycott, the activists sought to bring about political, social, and economic change, and therefore was sufficiently expressive to come under the protection of the First Amendment. But the right to boycott protects more than merely expressive rights. Although the AAUP's argument in the Yale's case was mainly framed in terms of protecting universities' right to control the messages they send, another value implicit in its argument was that of protecting the right to enforce the principle of non-discrimination. So through boycott, you can protect other substantive rights other than the right to expression. And so as one professor put it, academic freedom is not only an end, it's also a means for realizing other important ends, including individual freedoms that go beyond expressive freedoms to encompass all freedoms such as non-discrimination. The AAUP, as another example, also endorses in certain cases the tactic of the academic strike as an appropriate tool to bring about social change. It explains that sometimes resort to economic pressure through strikes or other work actions may be necessary and unavoidable means of dispute resolution, even when it involves actions targeting academic speech, such as asking outside speakers not to come to campus during a strike. In those cases, other means could have been employed to achieve the same ends, such as public condemnation, which it believes the BDS movement should restrict itself to, or debate about the administrative policies the faculty members were opposing. But the memberships determined that other means had failed or proven insufficient, and the AAUP ultimately often supports them in that decision to strike, which in a strike, of course, does shut down academic speech completely on campus during the duration of the strike. So I'd argue that the AAUP's position on academic strikes and boycotts is inconsistent. Both are nonviolent means of activism that use economic pressure to achieve larger economic, social, and political ends, and even academic freedom for subjugated populations. But the AAUP thinks universities should confine themselves to making statements condemning Israeli oppression of Palestinians. In discouraging the establishment of a campus in a country with laws that violate human rights, the AAUP also suggests that the use of the academic boycott is not only a right but an obligation. The AAUP recently sent a letter to Yale University reiterating concerns about its collaboration with Singapore's government in establishing a campus in that country. It asked that Yale take a number of steps to ensure that academic freedom and human rights were not undermined by the collaboration, and even suggested total withdrawal from the partnership might be necessary. So that's another case in which the AAUP supports the suppression of speech in order to achieve other ends. So the question remains whether the AAUP will apply these principles in Israel-Palestine, where it stands to influence global human rights to a much greater degree, given the United States' much more extensive political, economic, and cultural engagement there. I call on the AAUP to respect the decision of Palestinian and Israeli academics, as well as their colleagues and supporters around the world, to adhere to PACB's boycott call, not merely to further the human rights of Palestinian Arabs, dissident Jewish Israelis, and their supporters, but also to further the fundamental American values the AAUP was created to safeguard, including the freedom to disassociate from institutions that perpetuate Israeli apartheid. Thank you.
I'll just stand here. What we're going to do in terms of the question-answer period, I'm going to take 6 questions, seriatim, and then I'm going to then ask the panelists to answer them as they feel fit. And the first question I am going to take from my very good friend, Carl, who's right here, studying his iPhone.
Thanks, Dean, and thank you all for speaking. I had a couple of questions about, first of all, the important role of the churches, and really the students, it seems to me, have been, you know more about it than I do, students have been involved with the churches at some of these annual meetings that they're having and decisions that they're taking. Could you tell us something about that? I believe also in the context of students, the Hampshire College was the first college that decided to boycott South Africa. And so Hampshire College's, the way it effectively did boycott, is an enormous symbol that has been picked up in the States and that you see in Israeli press as being something that is such, this kind of thing being such a frightening challenge to them. The second thing related to that is that I was just amazed about 3 weeks ago to read something to the effect that the Israeli government and agencies, various kinds of agencies, have come together to put together $300 million. $300 million to support what they call diaspora relations, diaspora affairs or something, which will involve 150 campus partnerships in the U.S., presumably of which will be getting a lot more money than they've been getting in the past under support to the Hillel Foundations and the David Project and this kind of thing. So I wonder if you might want to talk about that, and perhaps also the effect, which would be part of this whole thing, of the birthright trips, which go largely to young Jews, many of whom are students. I understood that it's already, with Sheldon Adelson's support, gone up to 50,000 students this year. So you might wish to talk about how that fits in with, and how a BDS movement that basically has no money from anybody. I mean, this is volunteer work. And when you see 10,000, 50,000, $1 million, $300 million, you really begin to get a sense of what the magnitude is of what the people calling for BDS are up against.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
I don't understand what the word delegitimize meant when you mentioned it. You said to delegitimize Israel.
They'll answer that. Jane?
I wanted to know more about the anti-boycott laws.
Okay. 3 questions. Any other ones? All right. No other ones? One right here.
Yes. Do you think it would be useful for the BDS movement to talk about U.S. support for Israel. Since without it, the Zionists, or the Israel Firsters here, would have no power to do anything.
That's the fourth question. Fifth, back here.
In relation to that, I was curious about academic boycott and whether or not that should be brought to like U.S. universities and to professors that might support Israel in their classes or something like that.
Five, one last question, then we'll take the answers. No more? Yes.
I don't have a right to ask a question,
Why don't you?
partly because I disagree with everything I've heard, but secondly, because my credentials are biased. I'm former chairman of Hebrew University. I'm former chairman of Tel Aviv University. And I have been to the Middle East many, many times, well over 300 times, and not only in Israel, but in the neighboring countries. So I have to take issue with a couple of things.
Well, do you have a question?
No, sir.
You don't have a question?
No.
No. Well, if you want to make a talk, then we're just taking questions. This is a question and answer period.
Ah,
All right?
okay. Then I'll ask one question.
All right. That's fine.
Are you aware that the so-called Presbyterian boycott was vetoed?
All right. That's fine. Okay. That's the last question.
Okay.
All right.
But under the circumstances, I think I have to leave.
Okay.
Because I've heard.
Why? Why not?
Because I'm not allowed to rebut any of the things that I've heard.
Yeah, but
And the timing was,
I think you should listen, just so that you could have more gravitas to your point of view when you hear the point
this
of.
gentleman just advised me that I'm not entitled to do that.
No, but you should listen. That's why some of us.
No,
are
I have
here.
listened for an hour and
Fine. Now listen.
15 minutes.
I don't want to
bother
If
you.
you
No,
have
no.
a question.
No. I don't have a question.
Okay. You have a question. You answer, and then they'll answer it. All right. Maybe you want to answer the question first, which is the question he asked was.
The Presbyterian.
Oh yeah, the Presbyterian had been annulled.
Both the Methodist and the Presbyterian General Assemblies adopted resolutions supporting boycott of settlement goods. Both of them did that. The Methodist resolution adopted strong language condemning the settlements. Both assemblies had before them more ambitious resolutions as well, which would have adopted full BDS policies, and fully in favor of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And each of those resolutions lost to political maneuvers that were not anticipated by the proponents of the resolutions, and even then by very, very narrow margins. So the Presbyterians will be meeting again soon in Detroit, and many of the subsidiary bodies have endorsed the Kairos Call, which you should go online and read. It's a very stirring document, K-A-I-R-O-S. I would like to address some of the other questions, particularly the ABC questions that Harold asked.
Excuse me, I must leave you, and it's not because of your comments, but I do disagree with many of them, and I think I question the accuracy of them.
It's fine. That's
Thank
fine.
you.
You're entitled to a question. You're entitled to what
There wasn't questions, I wanted to make a statement. Thank you.
You asked first about churches, and I just made some response on that score. But the churches, along with students, have been absolutely crucial to the progress that we've made so far on boycott, divestment, and sanctions.
And 8 minutes.
We have until 2 o'clock.
So that's what the administration 150 to 150.
Okay, well, just finish up and then we'll wrap it up.
I'm going to leave it at that, given the circumstances. The 300 million, my understanding is that it was 300 million per year is being allocated for diaspora affairs, and I assume because of the hugeness of the sum that this is likely to be allocated to media that is advertising on TV, probably, and in other media, is my guess. We'll see what happens. I mean, so far, frankly, I think the opposition, the tone of the opposition has exposed the opposition for being, very bullying and very inaccurate, and has only aided the BDS movement, actually. The birthright trips are, I don't know if you all know about birthright, but what I find particularly offensive is that more and more of these trips are being offered to campus groups, and campus groups are going. I'm talking about every high-level official and of the administration, of the boards of regents, of the faculty chairs, the student government leadership are being invited on these birthright trips. And if a school is going to do something of that sort, which is a very one-sided presentation of the issue, it's basically an Israel propaganda trip, in my opinion, then it has if it has any academic integrity, it must present a balanced opportunity to get the opposing perspective with trips to the Palestine-occupied territories. And in fact, that was suggested at Wayne State University, which accepted one of these massively comprehensive birthright trips. And the faculty member who suggested it was the subject of retaliatory action by the administration, which is busy making contracts with Israel, actually. The dollar disparity between the movement, activists, and its opposition is not anything that scares me in the slightest. I've spent my whole career representing rank and file union members who have no money and who, in successful opposition to the union administrations. And what we have going for us are the facts. Our opponents no longer argue the facts. They have given up arguing the facts. They argue anti-Semitism, that what we are doing is anti-Semitism, although in fact, if we lump together all sorts of criticism of Israel as being anti-Semitic, then that is essentially, that sort of argument, ironically, has the characteristic of anti-Semitism itself, because it is treating all Jews as identical. Most Jews, actually, are not in Israel. And 1/5 of the population of Israel is Palestinian. And a large chunk, not as large as it used to be, but a large chunk of the Jewish population in Israel is also opposed to the official policy of the state. So ironically, we are talking about an argument which itself assumes as its premise what it condemns as anti-Semitism when it appears in others, which is the lumping together of the responsibility for among all Jews collectively, as though we're all the same. And I'm going to
I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm sorry we didn't get to answer all the questions. I'm sorry we didn't have more time for questions. But this hopefully is only the beginning of a discussion on this issue.
Yeah, and I want to say,
and I want to thank the Lawyers Guild again for hosting us.
And if you want to continue the discussion, maybe you guys could wait down in the atrium, and if you have any more questions, they could answer it right outside.
Fine.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Sure.